Welcome back. In this video, this will be a continuation of things I would like to see from the next installment of Civilization, which is expected to be called Civilization 7. So this will be part 3 in that series. And if you have not seen parts 1 and 2, I will leave them down in the pinned comment below. But let's get on with it. Number 9, food changes. Once refrigeration is researched, change from a city food supply to a national food supply. By the way, can't believe refrigeration tech wasn't in Civ 6, as it was hugely important during the 1900s. This would allow for further city specialization later in the game. Already hit on that topic in the industrial zone section, but my capital here, Guaigu, sure. A lot of mining production around my city here. I know I've taken up some of it with districts and wonders and stuff, but I didn't really have a lot of food production around really at all. I had some over here. This is one reason why I made that city. Until I came over here and took over the Aztecs, and then they had quite a bit of food land. Like I would turn all of these cities into massive food production to support the rest of my civilization. Like that's how I would imagine that should work. Like all of these should specialize in food production. If you have a really productive city with lots of hills, but have to find a way to generate food either by farming some hills or having a trader bring in food, is not the best way for the city to specialize. Would even like to see plagues introduced if a city grows too large before tech and buildings can support the population, like the Black Plague that happened in Europe during the 14th century. And maybe if I come in contact with a civ that hasn't grown as much and never experienced the plague, they would then experience it. Kind of like a Trojan horse and what happened when the Europeans came to the Americas. Number 10, military units base bonuses. No clue why Civ 6 units don't have base bonuses. This is one thing Civ 5 had right. The Spearman unit says it's an ancient era anti-cavalry unit, but yet it doesn't provide any bonuses to anti-cavalry unless you do combat and then promote it, and hopefully it makes it to its promotion so you can promote it and it actually be beneficial for its role. And what wound up being the unit to make in Civ 6 is the most powerful one you can at that time. Or if you needed something for a special purpose. Basically, you would get the promotion window and you could see that you would have a different kind of tree or kind of two lines of trees, and they kind of overlap later on. But the first couple of promotions would be kind of that unit's specialty area, but you have to do some combat early on to be able to get to those specialty promotions for your unit to even be beneficial. If I'm getting attacked by horses, I want units that will help immediately, not after winning several battles and hoping they survive, to just get a promotion. Number 11, military unit changes at industrial era. Okay, this is another kind of long one. A lot of things I just want to make sure I clearly convey in my messaging. I'll even show some examples here. First of all, in Civ 6, the machine gun unit comes way too late. Here in the tech tree, it comes at advanced ballistics. This is well after artillery. This is well after AT. This is well after tanks. I mean, the whole purpose of tanks was actually to take out the machine guns in World War I. Machine guns should come shortly after line infantry, which in Civ 6 was at military science, as the machine gun on cart paved way for armies to no longer stand in the open field, which gave way to the infantrymen. Starting in the industrial era, I would like to see military units have 3 levels, like 3 different generations of evolutionary levels. Machine guns, like I mentioned, used to be big, slow, and wildly inaccurate, as armies used to just stand in open fields with line infantry. This was Gen 1 machine guns. But once armies stopped standing in the open field and started being in cover and flanking, which was the rise of the infantryman, the machine gun needed to upgrade, and it became smaller, lighter, and easier to field deploy. The water-cooled MGs, this was Gen 2, this was the dominant weapon in World War I, and really, the machine gun has only seen efficiencies one more time during its evolution. This would be like Gen 3. So for example, Gen 1 machine guns would have a movement of 2, melee of 45, ranged of 75, range of 1, sight of 2. Gen 2, keep the same movement. The melee takes a pretty good bump as it's not as easy to flank anymore, or not as easy to kind of get on the edges as much anymore. From the better field deploying maneuverability of it. Ranged is 80, a little bit of an uptick there. Range, knock it up 2. We did see quite a bit of an uptick in accuracy from basically Gen 1 machine guns to Gen 2. And then Gen 3 would be melee of 70, ranged 85, range stays at 2. Everything else is kind of the same. So that would be kind of the way I would maybe look to do this. What about the tank? Well, Gen 1, around the time of World War I, was slow. Firepower wasn't great, but impenetrable to small arms. It was the armor that was the big winner here. And anti-tank was needed and came to the battlefield in the form of modified artillery. Also, Civ 7 should clearly have armored units immune to small arms units. Once people figured out they could just put explosive on a tank and other tanks entered the battlefield, tanks upgraded with better speed, better firepower, and armor. This was Gen 2 during roughly World War II. Then the tank arms race just took over and improvements continued, but range was more important, as the best way to anti-tank a tank was a tank at range. This was Gen 3. So basically Gen 1 tanks would have a movement of 1, a melee of 75, no ranged or range abilities, and a sight of 1. If you know anything about the early era tanks, the tanks that we saw at the end of World War I, they were awful. You could barely see out of them. Sometimes they killed their own people because they didn't even know, they couldn't tell who they were looking at. But they were basically impenetrable to machine guns, which were mostly dominant during most of World War I. Gen 2 tanks would have a movement of 2, melee of 80, ranged of 65, and a range of 1. Sights, now 2. And that would be roughly the World War II era. And then Gen 3 would be the post-World War II era, or the start of the Cold War. A movement of 3, melee 80, ranged 85, range of 2, sight set at 2. Maybe you would like to see a system to where researching the technology doesn't mean you can make the unit until you see the unit it is designed to destroy in the field. Like swordsmen gave way to knights, then pikemen, then men-at-arms, then musketmen, and so on. Military leaders basically never improved on what was working at the time. This could also be a way to keep the game a little more balanced. We'd also like to see an end of one era and the beginning of another. The Cuirassier and cavalry units would be the end of the horse cavalry unit pass, whether light or heavy, which horse cavalry typically starts with the horseman unit in most Civ games. In Civ 6, it started with the heavy chariot. Tanks for the armored cavalry path and helicopters for the air cavalry path would need to be produced fresh. This would signify the end of horses as a strategic resource and more of a luxury, and oil as the new king. Many military leaders didn't want to give up on horse cavalry as they were historically proven, and how it applies in game if you have many horse cavalry units on the field, and just being able to upgrade to tanks is too easy of a massive power bump. Many Civ games in the past have been about the rush to tanks. Also, infantry shouldn't just be upgraded to mech infantry either. Keep infantry as a unit when mech infantry enters the game. Basically, if there's a mechanical upgrade from one unit to the next, it should be produced fresh and not upgraded. I'd also say a limitation on siege units being upgraded starting at bombard or artillery. Non-siege ranged units should have one attack per turn against units that move in its range. Archers, machine guns, tanks, if they have it, anti-armor. Anti-tank units, AT crew and modern AT crew in Civ 6, classification should change to what I just mentioned, anti-armor. Tanks, mech infantry, helicopters, mobile artillery should be vulnerable to anti-armor. Should have ranged attack, but only against armored units. Obviously starts at 1 range and eventually get to 2 range. Corps, armies, fleets, and armadas combined with different units, like 2 tank and 1 infantry, 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 1 submarine. There's a tech in Civ 6 called Combined Arms, but you can't combine arms of different units, which is what Combined Arms means. If you make an army for a modern armor, infantry, and modern AT, and did a ranged attack 2 tiles away on infantry, then just the modern armor would engage. But if it was against a tank, then both the modern armor and modern AT would attack. If it was against another army of modern armor, mech infantry, and helicopters, then the modern armor attack would be split between the modern armor and mech infantry, and modern AT would be split between the 3 of them. Seeing a new combat unit should give a 90% Eureka to that tech, as coming up with an idea is the hardest part. Once you see an idea, you just got to make it work. Still would need to research all preceding tech, get resources, and build upgrade units. This is kind of what happened when the Germans first saw tanks in World War I. They didn't come up with the idea, but once they saw the idea, they were quickly to get their idea working and in the field. And that will end part 3 of this 4-part series. Let me know what you think down below, and I'll see you in the last one. Alrighty, take care.